Hello, and welcome to our webinar about our second Agile micro-credential called Implementing Agile. Now there's three parts of the Agile tester credentials, and it's basically three micro-certifications. So the first one, Agile Concepts, is already out there and available. Implementing Agile is coming in a couple days, actually, and that is our second micro-credential. And then the third one, Making Agile Work in the Real World, is coming soon after that. So in the first one, the Agile Concepts, this talks about the goals of the Agile methodologies. There are multiple methodologies. So it talks about how they differ and what kind of approaches are different between the different types. Scrum is by far the most common. So that's the one that we use as basically the example. I'll talk about the basics of Agile. What is an Agile project? What does it do? How does it work? What are the components? There's a lot of emphasis in terminology in this micro-credential, and you need that, honestly, in the Agile world, because Agile people will think you're dumb if you don't know what planning poker is, for example. So it goes through a lot of the terms, uses them, explains how they're used, and also will help you a lot if you're in an organization that's implemented Agile, sort of. And that kind of lets you tell what's would be there if it were a pure Agile versus what they've done. So you can kind of understand bridging the difference between the two, because that's honestly where testers get in a bit of a bind, is where it's a partial Agile implementation. And therefore, there's a lot of shortcuts being taken and a lot of issues that crop up for testing. Talk about how to make Agile successful. And obviously, what are some of the risks that come with it and how to mitigate those risks? Because there are a lot of risks. You lose a lot of safety nets with Agile. And that's one of the issues that we have in an organization that's implemented a, shall we call it, non-pure model. And then we'll talk about the different methodology types and how they're used and what is more appropriate in which environment. So that's the first micro-credential. The second one talks about implementing Agile, and that's the one we're talking about today. It talks about how we establish the team, who's on the team, what do they do? How do we define process? How do we do planning so that it's not onerous? Because we don't have time, honestly. There's never enough time. But what planning needs to happen, and how do we do that effectively? How are requirements defined, and how are those recorded effectively as well? And we'll talk a bit about some hierarchical stuff that can help organize the requirements. And then testing. How do we make testing work in Agile? And that's really what we're after, right? Is to make sure that when Agile is being implemented, that we're able to implement testing so that it works effectively. We don't go crazy. We get done what needs to get done. And we're basically giving the user the quality that they deserve. And then the last micro-credential talks about making Agile work in the real world. And this is talking about what really makes Agile work. What are the things that actually will make it work? And obviously some discussion about what will make it fail. So it talks about things like, well, these are the problems that we see, and these are the solutions to the problems that we see. And then more about testing in the Agile environment, making sure that testing is actually effective, that we do end up with what we need to have, and that we end up in a situation where we know that we have released quality to the user, that the user has had a good experience. I've certainly been on Agile projects where the users were really enthused at the beginning, and in the end, they were really disappointed because they hadn't gotten what they wanted. It had been factored out because it ended up with just delivering a minimal viable product, which was, in their opinion, not viable because so many of the features they'd been promised and were excited about got taken out. And in the end, they felt like they'd been involved in something that didn't even really happen. So really a negative experience. And that's why we want to make sure that when we're testing, it is a good experience, because if it's a good experience for us, it's going to be a good experience for the users. And that's really our goal. So why are you after an Agile credential in the first place? Well, honestly, because we need to be able to work effectively in an Agile framework, because it's out there and there's a lot of Agile projects or projects that claim they're Agile out there in the world. So we need to be able to work effectively with that, regardless of how they've implemented it. Because while in a perfect world, we would be able to do all the implementation, unfortunately, there's a lot of poorly implemented Agile projects where they've taken shortcuts, they've cut a few too many rules out. And as a result, you end up with this kind of hybridish situation where, you know, things are sort of done Agile and they're sort of not, but they've taken away a lot of the structure of Agile, which makes it work. Now, I want to clarify, this is not a set of lessons on how to implement Agile. It's a practical view of how to work with it. Agile purists need to be aware here, not out there to offend you or make you look like this very angry ostrich. But this is not intended to replace the books on Agile. That's not at all what we're after here. It's not in complete alignment with all Agile protocols either, by the way. It's practical and designed for the practical tester. It's stuff that we can take, we can make work, and that will help our Agile project be successful. So not trying to break the rules, but trying to work within environments that are not quite as pure as they should be. So is this for you? Well, are you assigned to an Agile team, not sure how to make it work? Or you're assigned to an Agile team and it's definitely not working and you need to make some changes? Are you new on the Agile journey? Is this something that you've read about, haven't really tried it, haven't tried it in real life? Are you confused about what Agile is? Have you looked at it and you read the books and then you look at what your organization's doing and you go, whoa, these are definitely not the same thing. I should have added one in here. Does your organization traditionally call it tragile or fragile? Yep, that tells you something, right? There's already a negative thing going on about your Agile projects. So the goal here is we need to understand how testing can work effectively in an Agile environment or an Agile-ish environment. That's what we're after here. So if any of these fit you, then this is a great micro-credential for you. So we're looking at building our team. There's basically three entities in an Agile team. There's the Scrum Master, and that's the person that's making sure that we're all being scrummy, basically following the practices of a Scrum project. That's things like having the daily stand-ups. They usually conduct the stand-up meetings, making sure everybody gets a chance to talk, making sure everybody's represented. They also make sure that we do all of the ceremonies, like the demonstrations at the end of a sprint, like the retrospectives, and they make sure that basically any obstacles are removed. That's the Scrum Master's job. Then we have the product owner. The product owner is the person who represents the users, and they make sure that the user gets what they want. So the product owner is the one writing the stories usually. They're the one making sure that the grooming sessions go well, that the acceptance criteria are in line with what the user wants. And then they follow this through answering questions from the team as the development and the testing is ongoing, and making sure in the end that the user is happy with what they got. And if not, then entering the changes into the backlog so that we have that kind of constant change thing going on. And then we have the developers, which clearly is the creepy guy at the bottom here. But notice, it's just the developers. This actually means developers and testers. They're lumped together in Agile projects. The idea being that developers should always be developing very high quality code. Quality is everyone's responsibility. And in the original Agile concepts, there really wasn't testing. Obviously, that's changed in industry because testing is needed, and testers are very commonly, almost always, part of the Agile team. But got to be careful because testers can sometimes get sucked into development tasks because nobody's doing them. And you have to be careful doing that because while that may be fun, that may not be getting the testing done. So got to be careful when you're crossing over between there. And you might notice that business analysts are missing. What do we do without our business analysts? Well, theirs is a tricky one. So ideally, the product owner is basically taking that role because they're representing the user, they're understanding what the user wants, they're getting it out there. The problem without BAs is you may lose some of that knowledge within the organization, long-term planning, long-term goals of where the systems are going, and also when you're integrating multiple Scrum team outputs together, it really helps to have that BA kind of behind it, knowing how all of this stuff's going to work together. So really nice if you can have a BA around. They do tend to be external to a Scrum team. They kind of are floating around on the outside. Similarly with project managers. They're not part of the team, but there usually are project managers out there because although Agile, pure Agile is, no, you just develop until you have reached the product you want. In real life, there's schedules and there's budgets. And that's usually where the project manager comes in, is to maintain those and keep a track of those. Now, self-management is a great concept, right? Everybody's going to be self-managed. You know what? Not a lot of people are very good at self-managing. I know I've worked with people, I don't know how they even get to work each day. But it works great for some people, and others, wow, they just need more guidance. It's important to remember that what we need is maturity in an Agile team. Now, that's not equal to seniority, because I certainly know some people who have a lot of seniority and very little maturity. But maturity is looking at your ability to do your job and then help other people do their jobs, help other people be successful. So if you're a senior developer, you're also helping the junior developers when they need help. If you're a senior tester, you're helping getting the automation organized, you're helping other testers come on board. It's basically demonstrating that maturity, and that maturity is in working with the team and working effectively with the team. Now, decisions will have to be made by the group. Things like what's in, what's out, what's going in a sprint, what's not going in a sprint. If no one's in charge, that can be really hard to make a decision. And this is where the Scrum Master is guiding, but not managing the team. Same with the product owner. They're guiding, and obviously they're putting forward what they want their user, or what their user wants, but they're not making decisions. The team makes decisions together. So you need maturity in there, because there's always give and take in decisions. Now, one problem with Agile projects is you can't be fully in an Agile team and not have some kind of management somewhere that you report to, because there's still admin stuff, right? There's training, you'd like to get promoted now and then, you'd like to make sure that you get a raise. So somewhere there still needs to be at least an administrative manager for you. So this is where you get into matrix management, and we talk about that in the micro-credential. Requirements. So to me, the easiest way to conceive of requirements is with a hierarchical approach. And this starts with a feature, which is the wide view of what the user wants, which breaks into epics, which are basically super stories. And then stories are broken out of the epics. And those are little implementable pieces that provide value to the user. And they need to be implementable within a sprint. Now, a sprint is 2 or 3 weeks, so it's pretty short. And this is where you've got to be breaking these things down, but still thinking it's something that I can demo at the end of the sprint, and the user is going to go, oh, okay, I see that. So you got to be careful, because sometimes you can get so granular that it doesn't actually mean anything to the user. And if so, and maybe that's the right way to go, just make sure the user is primed for it. The last thing you want is for a user to leave the end of sprint demonstration and have them go, oh, there's nothing there. Oh, and do that again and again and again, because that's going to get back to management, and then suddenly your Agile team is going to be under a lot of scrutiny. Because remember, the way that we judge progress is based on working software. But if we say, oh, look, we did all these things, and the user is going, no, I haven't seen any of it, and what I got, that's not what I want, ooh, that's not going to go over well. So make sure that what you're implementing is something that the user can see and understands. And this is where sometimes you need to say, hey, these stories are part of this epic, which is part of this feature, and this feature is what you want. So you can see how these components work. Kind of setting that expectation for the users, and it's easier to understand this way when you kind of have it at this hierarchical level. So if your feature is, say you're at a bank, and your feature is, we want to do boat loans, because we've never done loans for boats. We think that's going to be excellent, okay? And then your epics might be, okay, it's a boat loan with no collateral and just a single loan person. Okay, there's probably a name for that, loanee. And then the stories for that are going to be, oh, well, single person, no collateral. So first of all, I have to have an application that allows no collateral. I've got to make sure that they can log in and create their account. They've already got an account. Okay, so you can start seeing how your stories are going to break out of there. And that's what we're after, right? Those implementable pieces that provide value to the user. Now, the last step here is the acceptance criteria. Each story should have acceptance criteria defined for it. And the acceptance criteria is what tells us if it works or not. Pretty straightforward, right? But because stories tend to be a sentence and not much more than that, we need the acceptance criteria to flesh it out and tell me, okay, well, what are the valid values? What are the parameters I need to be checking? Are there performance criteria on this? What are the things that I need to test? So the acceptance criteria should explain everything that the developer needs to implement, everything that we need to test, and everything that the user wants to see. So that's what we're after with the acceptance criteria. So they become very critical, as you can see. And these are basically defined during grooming sessions, where a story is selected from the backlog and then it is groomed. And part of that is defining these acceptance criteria. So critical step in making sure that developers implement the right thing, we test the right thing, and the user gets the right thing. And unfortunately, a step that's often missed in industry. So very important one. And if you're looking at process, things that you need to change from a testing standpoint, here's number one. Make sure you get in there and get those acceptance criteria defined. Now, there's a lot of tracking work, and usually it's with task boards. So basically, and the most simple of task boards would be, here's the to-dos, here's the stuff that's in progress, here's the stuff that's done. Done meaning it has met the definition of done. So the backlog or the product backlog, sometimes there's a sprint backlog, these track what is outstanding to be done. The task board then focuses on the work for a particular sprint or a particular release, which is a set of sprints. The team works collaboratively. Okay, so we have daily stand-ups, and these stand-up meetings are called that because you're supposed to be standing. Clever name, eh? It's kind of stupid when you're on a conference call, but you know, you can see where it came from, right? When the whole team is standing in a room, and then basically they look at that task board and say, okay, is this still correct? Are these all still in to do? What's the progress on these? Are these guys all still in progress? What's done? Things get moved across the task board, and then of course each individual shares what did they do yesterday, what are they going to do today, and are there any blockers? So that way the whole team stays together on what's going on, who's doing what, and where the status is on everything. Now, some very important rules in Agile. And I know some people have the impression that Agile's quite easy and free form and everybody kind of does what they want to do. No, there have to be some very strict rules. And the most strict of these are the definition of ready and the definition of done. And what these do is tell you, when am I ready to start? Okay, so, and start, obviously, start what? Start development, start testing, and you often have a different definition of ready for different phases of the project or different phases within a sprint. So definition of ready might be the acceptance criteria are defined and agreed. Well, it's pretty straightforward, but that's a great way to go back and say, I don't have acceptance criteria, I can't start testing. My definition of ready has not been met. So really good to define these up front, but remember, don't make a rule if you're not going to enforce it. So these need to be things that you're going to stick to. Definition of done. For example, one of them might be that there are no outstanding high priority defects. Okay, great. That's pretty straightforward. Now, why would we want that in the definition of done? Well, this is because we want to be able to assess our work and how much work we have completed. So if one of our completion criteria here, or the definition of done, is that there's no outstanding high priority defects, then if there is one, we're not done. Okay, that seems obvious, right? But over and over and over in projects, there will be this, oh, well, I'll fix it next sprint. Let's just go ahead and claim that it's done now. No, do not give in on that. They can't claim that it's done and therefore collect the points for the story unless it truly is done per the definition of done, which we all agreed to up front. So really important to make sure that these are stuck to. They really need to be enforced. And again, in the micro-credential, we talk more about what can go into a definition of done. But that's our goal here. These are rules. These basically say we're not going to go any further until this is ready. And that way, as a team, we can review that. Have we met the definition of done? No, we haven't. There's high priority defects. Okay, when are those defects going to get fixed? Where are they in the schedule? We can't have just shoved them into the backlog. We need to make sure that those are actually scheduled to be fixed. And then we can look at when this story might be complete. Otherwise, you can end up with a whole bunch of stories that are that old 90% done, but not done. Therefore, we can't really go on. We can't really accept that they're ready to go. Now in planning, there's usually two levels of planning. One is the release level, which could be over a set of sprints or a defined release, depending on how you do it. And that's really the more traditional test plan kind of stuff. But we're not going to write a huge document because documents in general are, you know, a lot of work, a lot of maintenance, and nobody else reads them. So sometimes this is just done in a meeting, which is documented, of course, for later. But what are test techniques we're going to use? So are we going to do black box, white box testing? We're going to use decision tables. We're going to do equivalence partitioning. What are we going to do? What is the test approach? And this tends to concentrate on, are we going to do functional first? Yes, generally. Positive path functional first. When are we going to do performance testing? When are we going to do security? Those kinds of things. Release levels where we define that definition of done and definition of ready. So again, that's kind of a project thing. It's not a specific sprint. It's outside a specific sprint. What are the automation requirements? When are we going to do it? How are we going to get it done? What kind of tools have we selected? How is that going to integrate with the release pipeline? All of those considerations. Data and environments. What data do I need? When do we need it? What environments do we need? When do we need them? What kind of access? What kind of permissions? If we're getting data from production, does it need to be anonymized? All those kinds of exciting items there, which can really screw up a project if you don't have them. Now, schedule. So this would be the testing schedule only. Sometimes a schedule, if you've got a project manager, sometimes this project manager is tracking the schedule and the budget. That's the ideal to me, is to have that project manager out there who's keeping track of that stuff. But somebody does need to keep an eye on the schedule. So sometimes it is in the testing plan. And then responsibilities, who's going to do what and how do we know that they did it? So for example, we say, hey, the developers are going to do unit testing. Great. Are they? And if they do, how do I know that they actually did it? Not that I'm not a trusting person, but I'm a tester at heart. Therefore, I'm not a trusting person. So how do I know? Is there a code coverage level? How do I verify? Then at the sprint level, our planning is very focused at the story level. It's estimating stories. It's assigning story points. It's doing the grooming. Picking the right stories, making sure that they've got all their acceptance criteria, their risk and priority are assigned. And then basically when we're picking the stories that are going to go for a sprint, that we've considered all this stuff and that we know at sprint level planning when we're done with that, and this is often done in what's called sprint zero. When we're done with that, we know exactly what we're going to do for that sprint, who's going to do it, when it's going to happen, and we've got all of the data and the documentation in place that we need to basically work effectively. Because you don't want to get halfway through a sprint and go, oh, okay, I've got time for another story. Oh, nothing's groomed. Oh, can't do it. Now with good story definition, the good practices here, there needs to be a relationship so that features and epics and stories make sense. Otherwise, you pop out a story for a user and you go, hey, look, here's our very cool ability to check the expiration date on a credit card. And they go, yay. Now, how does that work to anything that I actually want and that I'm actually going to be able to use? So having that relationship visually is really helpful for the users to understand that they are getting pieces that are going to build an epic and they're going to build a feature, which is what they actually want. This really helps with users not being dissatisfied because they see that they're building towards something that they're going to get. If you just give them a bunch of disparate stories that don't work together, don't provide any, meaningful functionality to them, they can get frustrated pretty fast. And then if you've got management asking them, so how are you feeling about it? And they're like, it doesn't feel like we're getting anywhere. Ooh, that's not going to go over well. So trying to keep kind of a map of individual stories to epics to features helps users visualize what they're getting and when they're getting it. Behavior-driven development is sometimes used, and that's also used as a basis for automation, usually with Gherkin with that given, when, then format. And again, we go into that much more in the micro-credential. Acceptance criteria are probably, to me, the most critical good practice. If you want to know what you're testing, you want the team to agree on what's being implemented, and you want your users to be happy. And then invest is one of the ways of evaluating stories. Anytime you go into a grooming session, it's really helpful to have a checklist, which helps you build the acceptance criteria. It helps you make sure that the story is well defined. And that way you don't kind of get too involved in the conversation and you're able to go, yes, but has it met these things? And invest is one of those checklists. So what we're after with that good story definition is clarity. We understand what it is. We know how we're going to go forward. Now in the micro-credential, we also talk about how to get testing done in an Agile environment, how to get automation developed, which can be really tricky because time is always a problem. And let's face it, manual testing is always going to win because if you're in a crunch, you're going to do that first. So how to get that automation developed effectively so that you do end up with automated regression testing when you need it. We talk about how to do good estimation with story points, what planning poker is, how to do effective grooming with some checklists, and how to define those good acceptance criteria. So all of that is discussed as part of the micro-credential. Now, one of the things to remember with testing is that it's not different in Agile. Good testing is still good testing. So you think, oh, well, you don't have testing levels. Well, okay, maybe you don't call them testing levels, but you still have to do everything in that testing pyramid. Unit testing still has to happen. There still has to be the near neighbor integration. We still have to do the functional testing and system testing to make sure that the requirements, in this case, the story definition and the acceptance criteria, are met. If we've got multiple systems, we have to integrate them together and test that they work. We have to have user acceptance testing, and we have to have some kind of verification in production. So that stuff still happens. The fact that we might not call them out as levels is a whole different issue. So that stuff still happens. The fact that we don't call them out as specific levels is just an Agile thing, but that still has to happen. We also have to look at how defects are going to be handled and when they're going to get fixed, what happens if they don't fit in the current sprint, how that actually gets resolved. And we'll talk about hardening sprints. And this is a sprint that's done at the end of the scheduled sprints. And it's usually done to do regression testing, performance testing, security, stuff where you need all of the components together. That's what a hardening sprint is for. And we'll talk about what documentation is needed, because you still need documentation. And I'm not talking about paper, right? I'm talking about like test cases, like test reports, things like that, and how to leverage tools effectively so that we don't spend most of our life writing documents. And tools and reporting, one of my favorite topics. But one of the problems with tools and reporting is we really need them, because in an Agile project, we're not going to have time at the end to do reports. We need to make sure that our tools have been tracking the data all along, that we've got good visible dashboards so that everybody can look and get immediate status and immediate updates. And we want to make sure that those tools are being used effectively by the team. So for example, if we've used something like a Jira and we've decided to put tags on user stories so that we can, sort them into certain categories or whatever, then everybody needs to be using those same tags and doing them consistently. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So talking about ways to use tools, use them effectively, making sure that we are using test management tools rather than task trackers, because when you use a task tracker, you don't end up with good trend documentation. Whereas if you have a test management tool, it understands what a test case is. It understands these things, and it's a lot easier to use those when you're doing an Agile project. So, and usually the main tools have plugins, like Jira has plugins with test management tools. So looking at making sure that our tooling is correct and it's done from the beginning so that we don't end up halfway through and go, oh, we should have been tracking that, darn it. And that's our goal with tools, making it more efficient, saving ourselves time, huge amount of times, and making data immediately available so that the whole team can say, oh my gosh, we're way behind on testing. That's what we want to do, is make sure that that data is always available. And that's basically our summary here for this webinar. Again, our Agile reminder here, it's great fun. There's nothing more fun than an Agile project, but they're also quite difficult to do. You've got to have the right project, the right team, and the right approach. There's a lot of rigidity in Agile to do it right. However, in industry, sometimes that rigidity is lacking, and that's what the webinars are about, is how to make testing work even in a non-pure Agile implementation. So I hope that was helpful, and I hope you'll go forward and take that micro-credential. Thank you. Oops.